The DNA results just came back, and according to the cold, hard data on that paper, I am the biological father of my own grandson. But here is the catch. I have never, not even once, touched my daughter-in-law in that way. What she planned is my ultimate public humiliation, a way to strip me of my dignity and throw me out of my own house, turned into her worst nightmare the moment I decided to set my genetic trap. You see, people often mistake gray hair for a softening of the brain, but they forget that a retired investigator doesn't just lose his edge because he's collecting a pension. My name is Arthur. I'm 65 years old, and for the last 3 decades, I made a living catching people in lies they thought were foolproof. I live in a house I built with my own hands, a place filled with memories of my late wife, Martha. But lately, the air in these halls has turned sour. My son, Mark, moved back in a year ago with his wife, Tiffany. At first, I thought it would be nice to have family around. I was wrong. Tiffany looks at me like I'm a piece of furniture that's gone out of style, something dusty and in the way of her vision for this property. Before we get into how I turned her own scheme against her, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I've got many more stories of justice and unexpected turns to share, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. It started during a Sunday dinner. Tiffany was swirling her wine, looking at Mark, then at me, with a look that made my skin crawl. She started talking about, quote, zero, and how Mark didn't really share many of my physical traits. She was planting seeds of doubt, suggesting that my Martha, the woman I loved for 40 years, hadn't been faithful. It was a calculated, cruel move, designed to make me feel like I had no biological tie to my son, and therefore, no reason to keep the house in the family. She wanted me broken. She wanted me gone. But she didn't realize she was playing a game with a man who knows exactly how to find where the truth is hidden. Dinner that night felt like a trap from the moment I sat down. The clinking of silverware against the porcelain was the only sound until Tiffany decided to drop her bomb. She sat there, picking at her salad with a calculated grace, before looking up with a fake, thin smile. She turned to Mark and said, "Honey, don't you find it strange how different your eye color is from your father's? I was reading an article about genetics, and sometimes things just don't add up." My son, ever the optimist, laughed it off, but Tiffany didn't stop. She sighed deeply and looked at me with a look of fake pity that made my stomach turn. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a cold, rising anger. She wasn't just questioning my son's parentage, she was dragging my dead wife's name through the mud right in front of me. I could see the wheels turning in Mark's head. He looked at me, then at her, his expression shifting from confusion to a flicker of genuine doubt. Tiffany knew exactly what she was doing. She was planting a seed of betrayal, trying to create a rift in the foundation of my relationship with my only son. She figured if she could prove Mark wasn't mine, she could make me feel like an imposter in my own home. It was a blatant move to make me feel vulnerable enough to sign over the deed to the house just to my love. I looked her dead in the eyes, keeping my face a mask of old, tired confusion. I needed her to think I was a broken man. My old detective instincts were screaming. She wasn't just being cruel, she was being tactical. I told them I'd think about it, making my voice sound shaky and defeated. I needed her to get comfortable, because in my experience, a comfortable liar is a sloppy liar. I was officially back on the clock. I played my part perfectly. For the next few days, I became the shadow in the corner of my own home. I moved a little slower, sighed a little deeper, and let my shoulders slump whenever Tiffany was in the room. I wanted her to believe she had already won, that her psychological warfare had broken my spirit. In reality, my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I was back in the field, and my own living room was the crime scene. I started noticing the small things, the things people overlook when they think no one is watching. Tiffany was constantly on her phone, her thumb dancing across the screen with a frantic energy. She would smile at her reflection in the darkened glass, a sharp, predatory grin that vanished the moment my son Mark walked into the room. But it wasn't just the phone. It was the frequency of quote 5 from Mark's best friend, Brian. Brian was always around lately, offering to help with chores or bringing over craft beer. He was a smooth talker, always flashing a white-toothed smile and patting Mark on the back. But I noticed how his eyes lingered on Tiffany when Mark turned his head. I noticed the way Tiffany's voice jumped an octave higher whenever Brian walked through the front door. And then there was the smell. One afternoon, after Brian left, I walked into the kitchen. The air was thick with a heavy, expensive cologne, woody and sharp. It wasn't the cheap spray Mark used. I saw Tiffany standing by the sink, smoothing her hair and looking flushed, her breathing a bit too fast for someone who was just cleaning. She jumped when she saw me, her eyes darting to the door Brian had just exited. "Oh, Arthur, you startled me. You're like a ghost," she snapped, her voice dripping with irritation. I just nodded vaguely and reached for a glass of water, acting like I hadn't seen the secret glance they shared through the window. She thought I was losing my grip. In truth, I was just starting to get a handle on exactly who I was dealing with. I knew I needed more than just a gut feeling. In my old line of work, a hunch gets you started, but hard evidence gets the job done. One Thursday evening, I made a show of being particularly exhausted. I complained about a phantom pain in my hip and told Mark and Tiffany that I was going to take a heavy sedative and sleep through until morning. I even let Tiffany see me, quote, ate a pill, actually just a vitamin C tablet. By 10 p.m., the house was mostly dark. I sat in my bedroom with the lights off, the door cracked just half an inch. My ears were tuned to the rhythm of the house. I know every floorboard that groans and every hinge that whispers. Around 11 p.m., the back door clicked open. It was a soft, practiced sound. I didn't move. I waited. Then came the voices. They were hushed, coming from the kitchen directly below my room. I moved like a shadow to the vents. "Is the old man out?" a male voice whispered. It was Brian. I'd recognize that smug, nasal tone anywhere. "Dead to the world," Tiffany replied, her voice dripping with a contempt that stung more than I expected. "He's so pathetic, Brian. He actually thinks I care about his family legacy. He's just a hurdle we have to jump over." I heard the sound of a wine cork popping. "They weren't even trying to be fast," Brian said, followed by a low chuckle. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. They weren't just having an affair. They were orchestrating a hostile takeover of my life. They were using my son's trust as a weapon against me. Tiffany giggled, a sound that used to seem sweet, but now sounded like glass breaking. "He's just a lonely old fool," she said. I stayed in the dark, my face a mask of stone. She was right about one thing. I was old. But she was dead wrong about me being a fool. The hunt was officially on. I sat in that darkness for a long time after the house went silent. My heart was steady now, replaced by the cold, familiar rhythm of an investigator on a lead. Tiffany thought she was the predator, and I was just a slow, grazing animal waiting for the end. She didn't realize that in this house, I was the one who knew where every trap was set. The next morning, I came downstairs looking like I hadn't slept a wink. I let my hand tremble slightly as I reached for my coffee mug. Tiffany was already there, glowing with a smug energy she tried to hide behind a mask of concern. "Arthur, you look terrible," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Did you think about what we discussed? About the DNA test? Mark is really stressed out. For the sake of his peace of mind, Don't you think we should just get it over with? I looked at her, making my eyes look watery and defeated. Maybe you're right, Tiffany, I whispered. I don't want my boy living with a shadow over his head. If you think it's best, I'll do it. Just tell me what I need to do. A flash of triumph crossed her face. It was quick, but I caught it. She thought she had broken me. She thought she was about to pave the road to my eviction. I already bought the kits, she said, her voice rising with excitement. A reputable lab. We can do the swabs tonight. It's all very professional. I nodded slowly, playing the role of the submissive old man. But inside, I was already 3 steps ahead. She wanted my DNA to compare it to Mark's, hoping to find a mismatch she could exploit. But I wasn't going to give her my DNA. I was going to give her something far more dangerous. If she wanted to use science to tear this family apart, I was going to use science to show the world exactly who she was sleeping with. The plan was formed. I needed a sample from Brian, and I knew exactly how to get it. Opportunity knocked on my door the very next afternoon. Brian arrived, as usual, carrying a 6-pack of beer and that persona that now made my stomach churn. Mark was still at the office, and Tiffany was upstairs, likely for their guest. I watched Brian from the porch. He was confident, leaning against his car, checking his hair in the side mirror. He treated my home like his personal clubhouse. Brian shouted, walking up the steps with a smirk. I forced a weak smile and invited him in. I told him I was trying to fix a leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, but my hands were too shaky. I played the quote 24 card with everything I had. Brian, wanting to look like the hero in front of Tiffany, tossed his keys on the counter and headed straight for the bathroom to quote 25. While he was occupied with the plumbing, I moved. I didn't have much time. I went straight for the kitchen counter where he'd left his keys and, more importantly, a half-finished bottle of water he'd been drinking from. But I needed something better, something undeniable. I reached into his gym bag that he'd dropped by the door and found his used towel and a discarded disposable razor he must have used after his morning workout. Using a pair of sterilized tweezers I had hidden in my pocket, I carefully collected several strands of hair from the razor and a fresh saliva sample from the rim of his water bottle. I placed them into a clean, airtight baggie I had tucked into my waistband. My heart was pounding, a rush of adrenaline I hadn't felt since my days on the force. Just as I zipped the baggie shut, I heard the bathroom door open. Brian called out, wiping his hands on his jeans. He looked at me, and for a second, I thought he saw the sweat on my forehead. But he just laughed, patted me on the shoulder, and headed upstairs to find Tiffany. I stood in the kitchen, my hand gripping the evidence in my pocket. I had his DNA. Now, I just had to make sure it took my place in the lab kit Tiffany was so eager for me to sign. The evening of the 27th arrived like a funeral procession. Tiffany had set everything up on the dining room table with surgical precision. She had 3 kits, one for Mark, one for their 3-year-old son Leo, and one for me. She was humming a little tune, her eyes bright with the anticipation of a predator about to close its jaws. Mark sat there, looking miserable, his eyes avoiding mine. He felt like he was betraying me, but Tiffany had spent weeks poisoning his mind. Tiffany said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She handed me the swab. I looked at it for a long moment, making my hand tremble. I asked for a glass of water, complaining that my mouth was too dry. As she turned her back to head to the kitchen, I moved with the speed of a man half my age. I had the sample I'd taken from Brian's razor and water bottle hidden in the palm of my hand, wrapped in a thin layer of sterile gauze. In one fluid motion, I swapped the swab she gave me for the one I had prepared with Brian's biological material. By the time she turned back around with the water, I was, quote, 31, the process, pulling the swab out of my mouth with a weary sigh. I tucked it into the vial and sealed it. She snatched it up almost immediately, her fingers trembling with excitement. She didn't even notice. She was too blinded by her own arrogance. She saw a defeated old man, not a detective who had just executed a perfect switch. She gathered the vials, labeled them, and placed them in the prepaid envelopes. "I'll drop these off at the courier myself," she declared. "We should have the results in a week." I watched her walk out the door, the evidence of her own destruction tucked under her arm. She thought she was mailing away my right to this house. In reality, she was mailing the confession of her own betrayal. Now, all I had to do was wait for the storm to break. The next 7 days felt like a slow-motion car crash. Tiffany was in high spirits, acting like she was already the queen of the manor. She started looking at furniture catalogs, pointing out how she wanted to modernize the living room, which was her code for throwing out everything that reminded her of my Martha. Mark, on the other hand, was a ghost. He barely spoke, the weight of the potential scandal crushing his shoulders. He looked at me with a mix of guilt and pity, believing that any day now I would be proven as someone who didn't belong in his life. I spent most of my time in the garden, watching them. I saw Brian come over twice. Each time, he and Tiffany would share these little glances, thinking I was too old to notice the electricity between them. They were so confident, so sure that the results would show I wasn't Mark's biological father. Tiffany even had the audacity to suggest I start looking at nearby, just to be proactive. She said, her voice dripping with venomous concern. I just nodded and smiled my tired, old man smile. I was playing the long game. I knew that the lab was currently processing those vials. In their eyes, they were comparing "39" to "40". But because of my switch, the lab was actually comparing Brian's DNA to the child's. The tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. On the 6th night, I heard Tiffany whispering to Brian on the porch. She hissed. I leaned back in my chair, hidden by the shadows of the porch screen. My heart was steady. They were so busy building a gallows for me that they didn't realize they had already stepped into the noose themselves. The storm was finally here, and I was the only one with an umbrella. The morning of the revelation was eerily quiet. Tiffany had insisted we all sit down in the dining room to open the digital results together on her laptop. She even invited Brian over, claiming Mark needed his best friend for emotional support. The air was thick with a tension that felt like a physical weight. Tiffany was practically vibrating with excitement, her fingers hovering over the mouse. "Are we ready?" she asked, her voice tight with a cruel anticipation. Mark looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, his face pale and his hands shaking. With a sharp click, she opened the PDF file from the lab. "Let's see the truth," she whispered. She scrolled past the technical jargon, looking for the summary. Her eyes scanned the document, searching for the sentence that would prove I wasn't Mark's father. But as she read, her face didn't fill with triumph. It turned a sickly, ashen gray. Her mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. Mark asked, leaning in. He grabbed the laptop and read the conclusion out loud. The room went dead silent. Brian's face turned white as a sheet. Mark looked at the screen, then at me, then at Brian. The math was simple, but the implication was a nuclear bomb. Since I knew, and Tiffany knew, that I had never touched her, the only way "48" DNA could match the baby was if the DNA provided for Arthur actually belonged to the baby's real father. By trying to frame me as an outsider, Tiffany had accidentally used Brian's DNA to prove that Brian was the father of her child, not Mark. How is this possible?" Mark stammered, his voice breaking. He looked at Brian, who was already backing toward the door. I stood up, my shaky hands suddenly firm and steady. I looked Tiffany dead in the eye. The mask of the helpless old man was gone. "The truth has a funny way of coming out, Tiffany," I said calmly. "You thought you could use my wife's memory to steal my home. But you forgot one thing. A detective always keeps his eyes open." The explosion that followed was inevitable. Mark's roar of betrayal echoed through the house as the life Tiffany had carefully built for herself collapsed into ruins in a single heartbeat. The weeks following the fallout were chaotic, but for the first time in years, the air in my home felt clean. Mark was devastated, but the truth, as painful as it was, set him free from a life built on a massive lie. He moved out to find his own path and clear his head, taking the time he needed to heal. Tiffany and Brian disappeared from our lives almost overnight, chased away by the sheer weight of their own exposed treachery. She tried to beg for a settlement, but with the evidence of her infidelity and fraud so clearly documented, she didn't have a leg to stand on. As for me, I didn't stay in that big, empty house. I realized that Martha wouldn't have wanted me to be a sentry guarding a pile of bricks and memories. I sold the property for a handsome price. The legacy Tiffany wanted so badly ended up funding my new beginning. I bought a comfortable, modern RV and a small condo by the coast. Now, my mornings aren't spent listening to floorboards or hiding in the shadows. They are spent watching the sunrise over the ocean and planning my next road trip. I've started a small consulting business, helping other seniors protect their assets, and I've never felt more alive. I'm not just surviving, I'm finally developing into the man I was always meant to be in my golden years. Looking back, I don't regret a single thing. I used my skills to protect my son and my home from people who had no heart. But I have to ask you, do you think I went too far with my genetic trap? Was I right to humiliate her so publicly, to save my son from a life of lies? Or should I have handled it quietly? What would you have done if you were in my shoes? If you enjoyed this story of justice and a well-earned new beginning, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Drop a like if you think Tiffany got exactly what she deserved, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. I read every single one of them. The end. Thank you for listening.